The Junction Diner, tucked into a small alley that intersected a major boulevard near the industrial parks of Port Newark, New Jersey, was always bustling with customers. During the evening rush, the air inside was thick with the rich aroma of food, the clatter of silverware on plates, and the lively chatter of working folks. The owner was Laura Collins, a woman in her 30s with a pleasant, energetic demeanor, famous for her incredibly flavorful home-style cooking. The diner's clientele consisted mainly of factory workers and truck drivers. They came not just for the affordable prices, but for the renowned signature pot roast, a dish Laura claimed was made from a family recipe, with a uniquely sweet and savory flavor. On one sweltering afternoon, Mike, a truck driver and a regular at the diner, stopped in for lunch as usual. He ordered a plate of ribs and an extra bowl of the hearty bone broth soup. Everything seemed normal. The owner, Laura, was cheerfully greeting customers, her hands moving swiftly as she plated the food. Behind the counter, in the sweltering heat of the kitchen, an older man Mike knew as Frank, Laura's husband's stepfather, was quietly helping with the dishes. Mike received his heaping plate of food and found an empty table in the corner. Today, the pot roast looked even more delicious than usual, with a deep, glistening caramel color. But when he took the first bite, a strange sensation hit his tongue. He was a regular, he had eaten here hundreds of times and was intimately familiar with this taste. But the texture of the meat today seemed slightly different, not like the usual cut of pork shoulder. And the layer of fat, instead of being a clear white, had a strange, yellowish ivory hue. It tasted rich, but it lacked the characteristic savory aroma of rendered pork fat. He thought to himself that she must have switched to a new supplier and, not giving it another thought, continued eating. But when he moved on to his bowl of bone broth soup, a true sense of dread began to set in. As he spooned up the last of the broth, a small, hard, opaque white object floated out from a piece of stewed bone. Mike frowned, thinking it was just a bone fragment. He was about to flick it away, but curiosity made him pause. He picked it up and placed it on a napkin to get a better look. And then, a chill ran down his entire body. The food in his mouth suddenly tasted bitter and disgusting. That was not a piece of bone. It was perfectly crescent-shaped with smooth curves. It was a human fingernail, with a tiny bit of flesh still attached at the base. A wave of nausea rose in his throat. Mike quickly looked around. Everyone else was still eating heartily. The owner was still smiling behind the counter. No one had any idea. Trying to stay calm, Mike quietly took another napkin, carefully wrapped the fingernail and the remaining piece of pot roast inside, and slipped it into his pocket. He hurriedly paid his bill and left the diner in a state of absolute panic. He did not continue on his delivery route. He drove his truck straight to the nearest Newark Police Department precinct. At the detective squad, Detective David Chen initially received the report with skepticism. A fingernail in a bowl of soup was a hard story to believe. But when he saw the physical evidence and the utterly serious expression on the reporting citizen's face, he knew this was no joke. Mike, with the clear-headedness of a professional driver, described in detail the abnormalities of the pot roast, from the meat's texture to the color of the fat. A horrific, though utterly insane, hypothesis was formed. Detective Chen immediately reported the incident to his superiors. Recognizing the extreme gravity of the situation, a warrant for a surprise administrative inspection of the Junction Diner was issued immediately. Just an hour later, a task force comprising homicide detectives, officers from the Economic Crimes Unit, and a health inspector arrived at the diner. Their cover was a routine food safety inspection. The owner, Laura Collins, seemed a bit flustered by the inspection team but maintained a calm and welcoming demeanor, inviting them in. Inside the diner, besides Laura, was her husband's stepfather, Frank, helping in the kitchen. While one group of officers dealt with Laura at the front, Detective Chen, along with a few detectives and a forensic expert, headed straight for the kitchen. The kitchen was cramped and hot. On the stove, 2 large cast iron pots were still simmering, emitting an enticing aroma. One was the pot roast, with its eye-catching caramel color. The other was the bone broth soup. A forensic expert, wearing gloves, used a large ladle to gently stir the bone soup. He suddenly stopped. He carefully lifted out a piece of bone. It was not a pork or beef bone. It had the distinct shape of a human rib. The air in the kitchen grew thick. Detective Chen signaled to his detectives. Everyone silently continued their work. The forensic expert continued to stir, reaching deeper towards the bottom of the pot. And then, he lifted something that would make even the most hardened individual shudder. It was a human skull, boiled until the meat had nearly all fallen off, leaving only the stark white bone with its two deep, empty eye sockets staring back at them. In that instant, Detective Chen gave the signal. NPD. Nobody move. Detectives swarmed in from the outside. Laura Collins and her stepfather-in-law, Frank, were immediately subdued. Seeing the skull being lifted from their own soup pot, both turned deathly pale, their limbs went limp, and they had no strength left to resist. The Junction Diner was immediately cordoned off. A horrifying case, one of the most gruesome acts of cannibalism ever seen, had officially been brought to light. The small, hot kitchen of the Junction Diner was now a sealed-off crime scene. The victim's dismembered remains, after being carefully collected by forensic experts from the soup and pot roast, were sealed and transported to the State Forensics Lab. Meanwhile, at the Newark Police Department, the battle of wits with the two suspects, Laura Collins and Frank, began. They were placed in separate interrogation rooms to prevent collusion. Initially, both feigned complete shock and fear, vehemently denying everything. They put on an act, clinging to a single, pre-planned story. Laura sobbed to the investigator that they were victims too. She claimed that this morning, her father-in-law and she went to the wholesale market to get supplies as always. A stranger saw they needed to buy a large quantity of bones and pork and offered to sell them a cheap lot, saying it was surplus from a food company. They bought it because it was cheap. How could they know they would be so vile as to sell them this? They were completely scammed. She pleaded for them to find the person who sold it to them. In the next room, Frank gave an identical statement. Their story seemed plausible, an attempt to shift all blame to an anonymous seller. But Detective Chen and his team knew it was just a clumsy performance. Their faces showed fear, but it was the fear of criminals being caught, not of innocent people being framed. While the interrogation was at a temporary stalemate, the most critical task for the team was to identify the victim. Detective Chen believed the skull did not belong to a stranger. It was highly likely connected directly to the two people sitting in the interrogation rooms. He ordered a team to review all missing person reports filed in the precinct and surrounding areas within the last month. Less than half an hour later, a startling piece of information came back, one that completely demolished Laura Collins's lie. Exactly 1 week ago, a missing person report had been filed at the precinct. The missing person was Kevin Collins, 33, a construction worker. And the person who filed the report was none other than his wife, Laura Collins. In the report, she claimed that after coming home from work, her husband had said he was going out for drinks with friends and never returned. She had searched everywhere and asked all his friends, but no one knew where he was. This detail was like a crucial puzzle piece suddenly appearing, making the picture of the crime clearer than ever. The wife who had reported her husband missing just last week was now arrested for cooking human bones in her diner. This could not be a coincidence. To further solidify the theory, Detective Chen sent a team of detectives to the neighborhood where the Collinses lived to gather information from neighbors. And what the detectives heard painted a full picture of a family tragedy, of simmering conflicts that had erupted into a blaze of evil. Neighbors said that while the Collins family looked happy on the outside, they had many problems internally. Laura's husband, Kevin, was a kind, hard-working man, but he suffered from an unspoken affliction. The whole neighborhood understood that he was impotent and could not fulfill his duties as a husband. An elderly woman who ran a corner store recounted that poor Kevin was gentle as a lamb, worked his tail off all day, and gave all his money to his wife. But, she noted, in that department, he just could not. Laura was still young, full of life. How could she stand it? It was like being married but not having a husband. Meanwhile, Kevin's stepfather, Frank, had moved in with the couple after his wife Kevin's mother passed away. He was a long-time widower but still physically robust. Another neighbor whispered that she always thought something was off between Laura and Frank. Kevin was at work all day, leaving the daughter-in-law at home with the father-in-law. Sometimes, she saw the way they looked at each other. That was not the look between a father and daughter-in-law. And with Kevin's problem, you know what they say about fire and dry straw. It is hard to say. The neighbors' statements provided the investigative team with a crystal-clear motive: an incestuous, illicit affair. Laura, unfulfilled by her husband, had become involved with his own stepfather. It was highly likely that Kevin had discovered this sinful relationship leading to a fatal conflict. Armed with this new information, Detective Chen returned to Laura Collins's interrogation room. This time, he did not ask any questions. He silently placed a photograph on the table. It was a wedding photo with Kevin Collins. Next to it, he placed a copy of the missing person report she had signed a week earlier. Detective Chen said, his voice calm but each word landing like a hammer blow, that they had reason to believe the man in her soup pot was her husband, Kevin Collins, the man she reported missing. He paused, looking directly into her eyes, which were beginning to show panic. He continued that her neighbors told them her husband was impotent, and they also said that she and his stepfather, Frank, had a very close relationship. He then asked if there was anything she would like to explain to them now. Hearing this, Laura's entire facade crumbled. The innocent, pitiful look vanished, replaced by the absolute terror of a murderer who had been exposed. She knew it was all over. Faced with Detective Chen's sharp evidence and reasoning, Laura Collins's entire defense collapsed. The woman who had pretended to be a grieving victim now trembled like a leaf in the wind. She knew any further denial was pointless. After a long silence, she lifted her tear-streaked face and began to confess. But it was a calculated confession, a story skillfully woven to transform herself from a mastermind into a tragic victim of circumstance. She admitted to the illicit relationship with her husband's stepfather, Frank, but she refused to accept it was her fault. She lamented the anguish of being a wife to an impotent husband, speaking of long, lonely nights and the desires of a woman in her prime that went unfulfilled. She sobbed that she was just a normal woman with needs, but her husband Kevin could not provide for them. He was a good husband, but he could not give her complete happiness. She claimed that Frank, a widower living in their house, saw her deprivation. At first, he only offered comfort, but soon his words and gestures crossed the line. She alleged that he was the one who seduced her with sweet words, taking advantage of her at her weakest moment. She wanted to resist, she claimed, but eventually gave in because in him, she found what her husband could not provide. Her testimony painted a picture of a pitiful woman pushed into a tragic incestuous affair by both her husband and his stepfather. And that tragedy, according to her, climaxed on that fateful day. She began to recount the story of the murder, but in her version, her role was minimal, while Frank was depicted as a vicious monster. She claimed that on that afternoon, while her husband was at work, she and Frank were having sex in the bathroom. Unexpectedly, Kevin came home early. He had low blood pressure and his boss let him leave. Hearing strange noises from the bathroom, Kevin became suspicious. Laura recounted, her voice filled with fear, that he kicked the door in and saw her and Frank completely naked. When Kevin saw them, he went insane. He grabbed a hammer from the corner of the house and was about to attack them. But the bathroom floor was slippery, she continued. He slipped and fell. The hammer flew out of his hand. She was so scared, she just screamed. It was her father-in-law, Frank. In his panic and fear of being discovered, he grabbed the hammer. She tried to stop him, but he was not listening anymore. He was like a wild animal, lunging at Kevin and hitting him in the head again and again. In Laura's version of the story, she was merely an unwilling witness, a passive observer to the entire event. After Kevin was dead, Laura wept. She was going to call the police, but Frank threatened her. He said she was there too. If she reported it, he would claim she planned the murder with him. He said she would go to prison right alongside him. She was so scared. She had 2 young children. She could not go to prison. She claimed it was Frank's idea to dispose of the body in such a barbaric way. It was Frank who forced her to help, threatening to kill her too if she refused. Laura's testimony was incredibly detailed and, on the surface, seemed plausible enough to make one believe she was truly just a victim. The investigators carefully recorded her entire statement. They knew that whether she was lying or not, this testimony was a direct admission of a murder and had implicated the other accomplice. With this first confession in hand, Detective Chen immediately moved to the adjacent interrogation room, where Frank was still maintaining his silence. The final showdown was about to begin. Frank, a man with a gruff, hardened appearance, looked up at the detective. He had sat in silence for hours without saying a word. Detective Chen did not ask many questions. He simply placed a digital recorder on the table and played a segment of Laura Collins's confession. The recording was filled with her sobs and her sharp, accusing words. It was my father-in-law, Frank. He grabbed the hammer. He was like a wild animal, lunging at Kevin and hitting him. Hearing the voice and the words of his daughter-in-law, his lover, Frank's expression slowly transformed. The stoic silence vanished, replaced by stunned disbelief, which quickly morphed into absolute rage. His coarse hands clenched into tight fists, veins bulging on his skin. He roared that she was lying, the growl of a betrayed animal. That damn woman. She was the one who ruined him. She was the one who got his son killed. The final wall of silence had crumbled in the most unexpected way. The detective's psychological tactic had succeeded perfectly. Stabbed in the back by his own lover, Frank had nothing left to lose. The rage in Frank, ignited by his lover's betrayal, completely shattered the wall of silence he had painstakingly built. He had nothing left to lose. In his absolute fury, he decided to drag Laura Collins down to the depths of hell with him. He began to tell a completely different version of the story, one in which the supposedly pitiful woman was revealed to be a true monster. Frank admitted to the illicit relationship with his daughter-in-law. He did not deny his own lust a long-widowed man living with a beautiful young woman. But he insisted that the initiator in the relationship was Laura. He confessed, his voice hoarse, that his daughter-in-law was always flirting with him. His son Kevin was weak and could not satisfy her. She kept coming to him, crying and complaining. She said she was young and could not live a cold, passionless life. Even if his heart were made of stone, it would soften to her words and actions. According to him, it was Laura who actively seduced him, luring him down a sinful path. He, driven by lust and a sense of pity, could not resist. And then he began to recount the events of the night of the murder, a version that completely contradicted Laura's. He confirmed that Kevin had come home early and caught them naked in the bathroom. He also confirmed that Kevin had grabbed a hammer and attacked them, only to slip and fall. Frank said, his eyes bloodshot, that when Kevin fell to the floor, he was just stunned for a moment. He was terrified. He was about to help him up and get on his knees to beg for forgiveness, but Laura would not let him. He said that in that moment, Laura's face held no fear, only a terrifying, cold determination. She was the one who picked up the hammer. He hissed through clenched teeth that she did not hand it to him right away. She held the hammer and whispered in his ear. She told him to kill him, and she would be his forever. Otherwise, he would never forgive either of them. This property, this diner, they would lose everything. In Frank's version, Laura was the mastermind, the devil who instigated the crime. He said he hesitated, but Laura thrust the hammer into his hand, urging him on. The promise of a future together, coupled with the fear of retaliation, made him lose all reason. He swung the hammer. But the one controlling the hammer, he claimed, was Laura Collins. And the most horrific crime, disposing of the body by cooking it into food for customers, he laid that entirely at his lover's feet. He claimed that he was panicking and just wanted to bury the body in the ground, but she stopped him. She was the owner of a diner, she knew how to handle meat. She was the one who said this was the only way to leave no trace. The bones for soup, the meat for pot roast. No one would ever know. He was so scared then, he just did what she said. Everything, from butchering the meat to chopping the bones, was done under her direction. Frank's testimony painted a completely different portrait of Laura Collins, a promiscuous, greedy, and cruel woman, a demon in the guise of a gentle wife. The investigative team now had two confessions. The actions and events of the crime matched perfectly with each other and with the forensic findings. Both admitted to the affair, to killing Kevin together, and to the barbaric disposal of the body. But regarding the role of the mastermind, the one who initiated the crime, their stories were polar opposites. Each tried to blame the other, turning their lover into the monster and themselves into a mere victim. Detective Chen sat in his office, placing the two confessions side by side. Who was telling the truth? Who was the real mastermind? Perhaps that truth would forever be buried under the deceitful words of two criminals. But for him, at that moment, it no longer mattered. Regardless of who started it, this crime was the product of them both. The woman's lust and the man's weakness and desire had merged to create a two-headed snake. He stood up and looked at his team, who were also exhausted after days of this mental battle. He said it did not matter who instigated it. They were both venomous snakes. They committed an unspeakable crime together, and they will both pay the price. He told them to prepare the file and recommend the prosecutor's office charge both suspects with murder with special circumstances. The investigation was officially over. The curtain had fallen on the Sinful couple's play, leaving behind only disgust for human nature and infinite pain for the victim's family. The conflicting confessions of Laura Collins and Frank, where each tried to paint themselves as the victim, did not hinder the investigation. Regardless of who initiated it, the undeniable truth was that they had both participated in a heinous crime together. To build the most solid case possible, leaving no room for the killers to change their stories at trial, Detective Chen and the prosecutor's office decided on one final procedural step: a crime scene reconstruction. A few days later, a police convoy brought Laura and Frank in separate vehicles back to the small alley where the Junction Diner stood. The entire area was sealed off. Curious neighbors watched from a distance, whispering as they saw the two people they once knew as a familiar owner and a family member, now dressed in prison jumpsuits, handcuffed, and walking sullenly under police escort. The reconstruction began a reenactment of the horrific crime at the very place it happened. First, investigators had Laura enact her part. She was led into the house, now cold and desolate. She pointed to the living room where her husband, Kevin, had returned. She then walked to the bathroom door, describing the moment Kevin broke it down. When asked to reenact the moment of the murder, Laura began to cry, pointing at Frank, who was being held in the yard. Then Kevin fell, she sobbed. It was him. He was the one who picked up the hammer. I begged him not to do it, but he would not listen. He did it. She acted out a scene of cowering in the corner of the bathroom in absolute terror. After filming Laura's entire testimony and actions, the investigators took her outside and brought Frank in. The stoic older man began his reenactment. The initial events matched perfectly, but when it came to the critical moment, his version was completely different. He pointed to where Laura had been standing. He said, his voice hoarse, that when Kevin fell, it was Laura who picked up the hammer. She pushed it into his hand, got close to his ear, and told him to kill him, and she would be his forever. He was so panicked then, his mind was a mess, so he did what she said. Two versions, one truth. To further clarify their coordination in the crime, investigators brought both of them into the bathroom at the same time for a confrontation and to reenact the disposal of the body. This was when their hatred and betrayal were most exposed. They continuously cursed and blamed each other right in front of the officers. But when asked to reenact the barbaric act of dismembering the victim, both fell silent, their faces pale with fear. Using professional techniques, the investigators compelled them to show each step. It was Laura, with her experience as a cook, who instructed Frank on how to butcher the meat and chop the bones. It was Frank, with his physical strength, who performed the most strenuous tasks. Together, for hours, they had turned their family bathroom into a slaughterhouse, transforming the body of their husband and son-in-law into ingredients for their diner. They pointed to the large cast iron pot in the kitchen where they had boiled the bones. They pointed to the large pan where they had cooked the last pieces of the victim. Every gesture, every reenacted motion, was another knife twisting in the gut of this gruesome crime. The entire reconstruction was meticulously filmed. It was living proof, an undeniable confession showing that regardless of who was the mastermind, this was a crime of perfect coordination between two killers. When the reconstruction ended, both Laura and Frank were escorted back to the transport vehicles. They no longer looked at each other. Their sinful love was now nothing but hatred and disgust. A few days later, Kevin's biological parents, having heard the news, made the long journey from their hometown. Detective Chen had to perform the painful duty of meeting them and telling them the whole truth about their son's death. When they heard that their son was not only murdered by his wife and her lover, but that his body had been turned into food and sold to others, the elderly mother could not bear it and fainted. The father, though trying to be strong, broke down and cried like a child. They had lost their son, and now they had to face a truth so cruel, an indignity so profound it was beyond words. Clutching a photo of his son, the old man looked at Detective Chen, his voice trembling but firm, and asked the officer to please get justice for his son and make those demons pay for what they did. Detective Chen held the man's frail hand tightly and assured him that the law would absolutely punish them accordingly. The case file, complete with all evidence from confessions and forensic reports to the reconstruction records, was finalized. The case was solved. But for those left behind, their battle with grief and loss had only just begun. The confessions of the two killers and the evidence gathered during the crime scene reconstruction closed the investigation. The file, filled with irrefutable evidence, was quickly sent to the prosecutor's office to press charges. A A few months later, the Essex County Superior Court opened the trial of defendants Laura Collins and Frank B. The pot roast murder case had sent a shockwave of horror through the public due to its savage details, which trampled all boundaries of morality and humanity. The trial attracted significant attention from dozens of media outlets and a large public crowd. The courtroom atmosphere was heavy. Kevin's elderly parents sat in the front row, clutching a photo of their unfortunate son, their eyes sunken from grief. They had waited too long for this day of justice. At the defendant's table, the sinful lovers no longer looked at each other with passion. They sat far apart, never once glancing at the other. Their faces were etched with fear, exhaustion, and hatred for their former accomplice. Their illicit love was dead, leaving only betrayal and the fear of the sentence they were about to face. In court, the prosecution presented a powerful indictment, laying out the entire criminal process of the two defendants. The evidence was presented piece by piece: the testimony of Mike, the man who bravely reported the crime, the gruesome photos of the skull and human bones recovered from the soup pot, the undeniable DNA analysis, and finally, the video of the entire crime scene reconstruction. When the video played on the large screen, the courtroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The image of Laura Collins and Frank in prison jumpsuits, coldly re-enacting the murder and dismemberment of their husband and stepson-in-law, caused a wave of absolute outrage. Many in the gallery could not stop themselves from shouting curses. During closing arguments, the defense lawyers for both defendants tried to argue that their client was merely a pawn, manipulated and instigated by the other, in an attempt to receive a lighter sentence. The blame game was re-enacted one last time, but it was all meaningless in the face of such overwhelming evidence. After deliberation, the jury returned, and the presiding judge delivered the final verdict. In a stern voice, the judge declared the defendants' actions to be particularly egregious, heinous, and devoid of humanity. Motivated by an illicit, incestuous relationship, the defendants had brutally murdered the victim. Not stopping there, the act of dismembering and cooking the victim's body into food to sell to innocent customers was a barbaric act, demonstrating a complete moral decay beyond any hope of rehabilitation. The defendants' attempts to blame each other did not change the nature of the crime, but only further showed their cowardice and irresponsibility. Regardless of who initiated it, both defendants were active accomplices who saw the crime through to the end. The judge declared that this crime must be punished with the most severe sentence possible. This court sentences the defendant, Laura Collins, for the crime of murder as a willing accomplice, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This court sentences the defendant, Frank B., for the crime of murder as a willing accomplice, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read, the courtroom erupted. Applause mixed with the sobbing cries of Kevin's parents. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served. Laura Collins and Frank B. collapsed at their tables, dragged away by court officers like two soulless shells. The case was closed. The Junction Diner was sealed and later demolished, but its story would forever remain a dark urban legend, a horrific scar on the city's memory. Through this tragedy, we see the most terrifying darkness that can exist within family relationships, where sacred trust is trampled by sinful desires. Emotional deprivation combined with unchecked lust transformed seemingly ordinary people into vicious demons, capable of acts no one could ever imagine. The crime of Laura and Frank did not stop at murder. The act of turning a loved one's body into a commodity, a meal, was the ultimate humiliation, an attempt to completely erase a person's existence and dignity. And perhaps the most frightening aspect of the case was its normality. The crime did not happen in some remote, desolate place, but in an ordinary house, a local diner where hundreds of people passed by every day. It is a stark warning that sometimes, hell is not some distant place. It can be simmering right inside the soup pot we eat from every day.